I never imagined my relationship with my in-laws would completely unravel over a collection of dusty old books. But there I was, standing in my late grandfather's study, clutching a leather-bound first edition with trembling hands, while Barbara, my mother-in-law, tapped her manicured nails against the mahogany desk. Her husband Harold loomed beside her, arms crossed, mouth set in that familiar line of disapproval I'd grown accustomed to over 8 years of marriage to their son. "We always knew you were after the Peterson family connections," Barbara said, her voice honey-sweet but eyes cold as Michigan winter. "But using a convenient inheritance to keep Michael trapped in this situation?" She gestured vaguely around the room, as if my grandfather's lifetime collection of rare books was some kind of elaborate scheme I'd concocted. "It's low, even for you, Jennifer." I felt the air leave my lungs, not at the accusation, those had become routine, but at the audacity of saying it here, in the sacred space of my grandfather's study, where I'd spent countless hours as a child listening to his stories about history coming alive through literature. Before I could respond, Diane, Barbara's ever-present shadow, chimed in from the doorway. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "Well," she said with a practiced sigh, "at least the books are worth something. Unlike that art degree." They exchanged knowing glances and suppressed smiles, as if I wasn't standing right there. As if my entire worth could be reduced to dollar signs and marriage certificates. Like my career as an art teacher, my love for my husband, and the family we'd built together were all part of some grand deception. I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I simply turned away and focused on the framed photo on my grandfather's desk. One of Olivia at age 7, painting at his kitchen table, tongue caught, between her teeth in concentration. Because just beyond the study door, my daughter was sitting cross-legged on the hallway floor, headphones on, sketching in her notebook, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her legacy. In that moment, I made a promise to myself. Olivia would never believe she was part of some scheme. Let Barbara and Harold think what they wanted. Let Diane smirk and judge. I would protect my daughter from their poison, especially from people who could look at a child's love and see only transaction. But that's not the part of this story that changed everything. The moment you need to hear about came 6 weeks later, during the reading of my grandfather's will. That's when my quiet, observant daughter, my Olivia, stood up in the lawyer's office, cleared her throat and said, "Mr. Franklin, I think this is important. Can I show everyone what Grandpa Ed gave me before he died?" The entire room fell silent. Mr. Franklin adjusted his glasses. Harold's face drained of color. Barbara, sitting primly in her cream pantsuit with her signature pearl earrings, looked like she'd swallowed something sour. And in that moment, my 12-year-old daughter held something more powerful than any legal document or rare book. The truth. Olivia was just 12, but she understood more than anyone. Realized. And for the first time, the adults in that room had no choice but to listen. But let me take you back to the beginning so you understand why that moment in the lawyer's office changed everything. Because it wasn't just one dismissive comment. It wasn't one uncomfortable holiday dinner. It was years of subtle undermining, of Barbara and Harold making me feel like an interloper, an opportunist, always the art teacher who somehow trapped their successful marketing executive's son. It was constant, but carefully disguised. When Michael and I first met at the Lakeside Arts Festival, where I was showcasing my paintings, the connection was immediate. He was there with clients, wearing a suit that stood out among the casual crowd, but he spent 2 hours at my booth, asking questions about my work, my techniques, my inspiration. I was 26, passionate about bringing art education to public schools. He was 30, established in his career, charming in a way that felt genuine rather than practiced. What I didn't know then was how his parents had already mapped out his future, which included a relationship with Elise, the daughter of Harold's golf buddy, a girl with the right family name and a business degree from an Ivy League school. Not a public university art graduate who taught middle schoolers how to express themselves through watercolors. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. I still remember the night he took me to meet his parents. Their house in Maple Heights was imposing, colonial style with perfect landscaping and a 3-car garage. Barbara greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, scanning my simple dress with a quick but thorough assessment. Harold asked about my hobby of teaching and seemed genuinely surprised when I corrected him that it was my career. "Teaching art," he repeated, swirling his whiskey. "That's different. Most of the women in the Peterson family orbit have been in business or law." "Not everyone can have such ambitious paths," Barbara added, patting my hand like I was a child who needed consolation. Michael squeezed my fingers under the table. I thought he was offering support, but later realized he was asking for patience. "Jenny's actually developing a new arts integration program for the district," he said proudly. Barbara skillfully changed the subject to Elise's recent promotion at her father's investment firm. The engagement announcement 6 months later was met with what I can only describe as strategic disappointment, not outright rejection. The Petersons were too concerned with appearances for that. But a carefully orchestrated campaign of subtle comments, sidelong glances, and helpful suggestions about prenuptial agreements. Olivia came along 2 years into our marriage. A beautiful surprise that transformed our world. Michael was smitten from the first ultrasound, and for a while, even Barbara and Harold seemed to soften. They showered their first grandchild with expensive gifts and professional photography sessions. But as Olivia grew and showed her natural artistic talent, clearly taking after me, the undercurrent of disapproval returned. "She's so creative," Barbara would say with a tight smile. "But perhaps we should enroll her in that math enrichment program too. Balance things out." Harold was less subtle. "Peterson women have always had practical minds," he announced at Olivia's 5th birthday party, watching her delight in the watercolor set my grandfather had given her. "This artistic phase will pass." But it didn't pass. Olivia bloomed into a sensitive, creative soul who could spend hours lost in her sketchbooks. She was also remarkably perceptive, noticing tensions adults thought were invisible to children. She saw how I would stiffen when Barbara entered a room. She noticed how Michael's voice changed during Sunday phone calls with his father. When my grandfather Ed fell ill, it was Olivia who sat with him for hours, listening to his stories about history and literature, about the rare books he'd collected over decades as a professor. He saw in her what I had loved as a child, a curious mind that found wonder in old pages and faded ink. "Books are time machines, Liv," he'd tell her. "They hold secrets from before you were born, waiting for the right person to discover them." The relationship they formed in his final months was beautiful and unexpected. While Michael was supportive but distant, busy with a demanding new position, and Barbara and Harold made only obligatory appearances at the hospital, Olivia became my grandfather's devoted companion. She'd read to him when his eyes grew too tired, and he'd tell her stories about each book's history, how he'd acquired it, why it mattered. When he passed away 3 months later, Olivia was inconsolable. Not in the loud, obvious way children sometimes grieve, but in a quiet, deep manner. That worried me more. She carried his dog-eared copy of Treasure Island everywhere for weeks. At the funeral, while Barbara complained about the modest church and simple service, Olivia stood straight-backed beside me, her small hand in mine, dignified in her grief in a way that made my heart ache. The initial reading of the will was straightforward. My grandfather had left his house to be sold, with proceeds divided between his favorite charitable causes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Personal items were distributed among family members. But the valuable book collection, worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, was left specifically to me, with instructions that it be preserved intact rather than sold off individually. That's when the trouble really began. Harold and Barbara couldn't understand why such a valuable asset would be wasted on someone who wouldn't appreciate its financial potential. The implication was clear. I would leverage the inheritance to somehow control Michael, to further trap him in a marriage they'd never fully embraced. "You could pay off your mortgage with just 3 of those first editions," Barbara pointed out during an uncomfortable dinner at their home. "But instead, you're keeping them in that study like some kind of museum. It's impractical." "They're not just commodities," I tried explaining. "They're my grandfather's legacy. He wanted them preserved, not sold." "Legacy," Harold repeated with a dismissive wave. "What good is legacy when you could be investing in Olivia's future? Unless, of course, keeping the book serves another purpose." The insinuation hung in the air. Michael, who had been supportive of honoring my grandfather's wishes, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing. His silence hurt more than Harold's words. The comments grew more frequent, more pointed. Barbara would send me listings for auction houses, just in case you reconsider. Harold began talking directly to Michael about family financial planning in my presence, as if I wasn't part of that family. When Olivia mentioned loving the books during a visit to their house, Barbara quickly redirected, "But wouldn't you love a college fund more, sweetie?" Michael started staying later at work. Our conversations grew shorter, more functional. I would find him in our home office late at night, spreadsheets open, rubbing his temples. When I asked what was wrong, he'd simply say, "Just thinking about our future." The pressure was working. The books were becoming a wedge between us, exactly as his parents intended. Then came the day I found Barbara and Harold in my grandfather's study without invitation. They'd stopped by unannounced while Michael was at work, claiming they wanted to take Olivia shopping. Instead, I discovered them examining the bookshelves. Harold with a notepad, Barbara on her phone. "Just getting some appraisal information," Harold explained without a hint of embarrassment. "For insurance purposes." "Michael gave us the key," Barbara added, though I knew that wasn't true. "We're only trying to help you understand what you're sitting on here." That's when they delivered their assessment of my character, their certainty, that I was using the inheritance to maintain my hold over their son. That's when I turned away to see the photo of Olivia, to remind myself what really mattered. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that Olivia had removed her headphones long enough to hear everything. My daughter, who noticed everything, who absorbed the undercurrents of adult conflicts like a sponge, had been taking mental notes for years. And she had been spending time alone in the study, connecting with her great-grandfather's memory in her own quiet way. The following weeks were tense. Michael and I had our first serious argument in years when I told him about his parents' uninvited appraisal session. He accused me of exaggerating. I accused him of enabling their behavior. We both said things we regretted. Olivia grew quieter, spending more time in the study with her sketchbooks. Then we received the formal notice from Mr. Franklin. The final reading of the will would include previously undisclosed codicils and specific instructions. Regarding the book collection, all interested parties were required to attend. The meeting was set for a Friday afternoon at Franklin Legal Services, a modest office downtown with landscape watercolors on the walls and a reception area that smelled perpetually of coffee. Barbara and Harold arrived precisely 5 minutes. Early Barbara in her cream pantsuit and signature pearls, Harold reviewing documents from his leather portfolio. Diane had been left behind, but her spirit was present in Barbara's confident posture. Michael sat beside me, tension radiating from his shoulders. Olivia had asked specifically to come along, which surprised us, but Mr. Franklin had agreed it was appropriate given her relationship with her great-grandfather. The proceedings began formally enough. Mr. Franklin reviewed the general provisions we'd already discussed, then cleared his throat. Now, regarding the book collection left to Jennifer Wilson Peterson, he said, referencing his notes. Edward Wilson added specific instructions about its maintenance and future disposition. Barbara leaned forward slightly, anticipation barely concealed behind her polite attention. The collection is indeed to remain intact during Jennifer's lifetime, Mr. Franklin continued. However, Edward was quite specific about the eventual transfer of the collection. That's when Olivia raised her hand, the way she would in her classroom. Mr. Franklin paused, surprised by the interruption from the youngest person present. Mr. Franklin, I think this is important, she said in a clear voice that belied her. Nervous fidgeting. Can I show everyone what Grandpa Ed gave me before he died? The room fell silent as Olivia reached into her backpack and removed a slim volume, one of my grandfather's less valuable books, a worn copy of essays I didn't recognize. She opened it carefully to reveal that the binding had been modified, creating a hidden compartment from which she extracted a sealed envelope. He showed me where this was, 2 weeks before he died, she explained. He said it was important, but that I should only share it when it was really needed. Her eyes met mine briefly. I think it's needed now. Harold made a dismissive noise, but Mr. Franklin extended his hand. May I see that, Olivia? She handed him the envelope, which was addressed simply, "To my family, when truth is required." Mr. Franklin opened it carefully and scanned the contents, his professional demeanor betrayed only by a slight raising of his eyebrows. He looked up at Olivia, with new respect, then addressed the room. This appears to be a letter from Edward Wilson, dated approximately 3 months before his death. It is witnessed and notarized. He adjusted his glasses. Would you like me to read it aloud? Barbara shifted uncomfortably. Harold checked his watch. Michael leaned forward, suddenly engaged. I nodded, heart pounding. Mr. Franklin began to read. To my family and those concerned with material matters. If this letter is being read, it means my great-granddaughter Olivia has determined that its contents are necessary. I trust her judgment completely. The book collection I have left to my granddaughter Jennifer is not merely a financial asset, but the physical manifestation of our family's intellectual legacy. These books have been gathered not for their monetary value, but for the knowledge and perspective they contain. I have become aware of concerns regarding Jennifer's intentions for this collection, particularly from her husband's family. Let me be perfectly clear. Jennifer has never once inquired about the value of these books. Even as a child, she loved them for the worlds they contained, not for what they might be worth. In fact, it was Jennifer who refused my offer, made during my illness, to sell several valuable volumes to cover my medical expenses. Books are meant to be read and preserved, not liquidated in emergencies, she told me. We'll find another way. And she did, working extra hours teaching summer programs to help with my care. This is the woman some have characterized as opportunistic. This is the woman who has been accused of using material things to secure her marriage. Nothing could be further from the truth. I felt tears welling in my eyes as Mr. Franklin continued. As for the eventual disposition of the collection, I have established a trust with specific conditions. The books will remain with Jennifer during her lifetime. Upon her passing, they will be donated to Lakeside University's Special Collections Library, with a reading room established in the Wilson Peterson name. However, there is one condition that must be honored. If at any point Jennifer is pressured to sell or disperse this collection against her wishes, particularly by members of her extended family, the entire collection will immediately transfer to the university, with Jennifer remaining as its lifetime curator. I have discussed this arrangement with Olivia, who understands its importance. She has promised to be the guardian of this truth. Mr. Franklin looked up from the letter, allowing its implications to sink in. The room was absolutely silent. "There is a bit more," he said, returning to the page. "To Harold and Barbara Peterson. I have met you only a few times, but I have observed how you look at my granddaughter, how you speak about her when you think. No one of consequence is listening. Let me assure you, Olivia has been listening. I have been listening. Your son, whether he acknowledges it or not, has been listening. Jennifer did not trap your son. She did not strategize to secure wealth or position through marriage. She loved him. She continues to love him, despite the wedge you persistently attempt to drive between them. If you value family legacy as much as you claim to value financial assets, I suggest you reconsider how you treat the mother of your grandchild. True wealth lies in relationships built on respect, not in first editions or investment portfolios. And Michael, if you are present for this reading, know that your silence in the face of disrespect toward your wife has been noted. By your daughter, by me. The legacy you leave is not measured in dollars, but in the courage you show when it matters. With love and hope for wisdom, Edward Wilson, Professor Emeritus of History. Mr. Franklin folded the letter and looked up. The document is properly witnessed and notarized. It constitutes a legally binding addition to the will. Barbara's face had gone rigid, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the flush of embarrassment. Harold stared at his hands, his usual confidence deflated. But it was Michael's expression that caught my attention. A mixture of shame and revelation, as, if seeing clearly for the first time, Olivia sat straight in her chair, no longer fidgeting. She met her grandparents' eyes without flinching, chin slightly raised in a gesture that reminded me powerfully of my grandfather. "There's one more thing," she said quietly, reaching into her backpack again. She pulled out a small sketchbook and opened it to a marked page. "I've been keeping a journal, like Grandpa Ed taught me, writing down things I hear and see. He said sometimes people don't believe something happened unless it's written down." She handed the open book to Mr. Franklin, who read it silently, then passed it to Michael. I caught glimpses of Olivia's neat handwriting, dates, direct quotes. Things Barbara had said when she thought Olivia wasn't listening. Comments Harold had made about me when he assumed Olivia was absorbed in her tablet. Michael's face grew increasingly pained as he read. When he finally looked up, his eyes held tears. "Mom, Dad," he said, his voice unsteady. "Is this how you've been treating Jenny? Is this what you've been saying to my daughter about her mother?" Barbara started to protest, to minimize, to reframe. Harold attempted to dismiss it as misunderstandings, exaggerations. But their defenses fell flat against Olivia's meticulous documentation and my grandfather's clear-eyed assessment. The meeting ended without resolution, just a heavy silence broken only by the shuffling of papers and Mr. Franklin's assurances that the legal arrangements would be honored. In the parking lot, Barbara attempted one last salvage operation. "We only wanted what was best for the family," she insisted, her voice losing its usual polish. These books could secure Olivia's future. Before I could respond, Olivia spoke up. "Grandma Barbara," she said with surprising gentleness, "Grandpa Ed already secured my future. He taught me that some things are worth more than money. He taught me to notice when people aren't being truthful. That's worth more than any book." On the drive home, Michael was silent until we pulled into our driveway. Then, with Olivia already headed inside, he turned to me. "I didn't know," he said simply. "I knew they were difficult, but I didn't realize. I didn't want to see how they treated you." "You didn't want to have to choose," I corrected gently. "I understand that. They're your parents." "But you're my wife," he replied, a new firmness in his voice. "And Olivia is watching how I treat you, how I let others treat you. Your grandfather saw it. Our daughter saw it. I should have seen it too." The weeks that followed weren't easy. Michael had a long, painful conversation with his parents. Boundaries were established. Sunday calls became less frequent, more intentional. Barbara and Harold were not immediately transformed. People rarely are. But the balance of power had shifted. The books remained in my grandfather's study, now our family's reading room. Olivia began cataloging them properly, creating a database of titles, publication dates, and the stories my grandfather had told her about each one. 6 months later, Barbara called and asked if she could visit, alone. She arrived without her usual armor of designer clothes and perfect makeup, looking older and somehow more human. "I've been reading," she said, gesturing to a book she brought with her, a biography of a female artist I admired. Trying to understand things I dismissed before. It wasn't an explicit apology, but from Barbara, it was significant. She asked Olivia to show her the cataloging project. She listened, really listened, as my daughter explained the history of a particularly rare volume. Small steps, imperfect but meaningful. Harold took longer. His pride had been wounded more deeply. But when Michael's company faced a crisis and I spent weeks supporting him through long nights and uncertainty, Harold witnessed a partnership he hadn't bothered to see before. Eventually, he too began to thaw, though our relationship would always carry the scars of those early years. The most profound change was in Michael. He found his voice, not just with his parents, but in our marriage. He began spending evenings in the study with Olivia and me, discovering the worlds within those books he'd previously seen only as assets or points of contention. As for me, I realized something important. I had spent years believing I needed to prove my worth to the Petersons, to justify my place in their family. The truth was, they needed to earn their place in ours, the one Olivia, Michael, and I had created, the one my grandfather had recognized and protected. People often ask if I resent Barbara and Harold for those difficult years. The honest answer is complicated. I don't carry bitterness, but I maintain clarity. They missed years of authentic connection with their son and granddaughter because they couldn't see beyond their own expectations. That's punishment enough. My grandfather's books remain intact, not as a victory trophy, but as a testament to what he understood. That legacy isn't about monetary value, but about the stories we choose to preserve, the truths we have the courage to speak, and the wisdom to know when silence serves no one. Olivia, now 15, still keeps her journal. She's becoming a remarkable artist, but more importantly, a young woman who understands her own worth isn't determined by others' assessments. Sometimes I find her in the study, carefully handling first editions with gloved hands, adding notes to her database, carrying forward a legacy that has nothing to do with market value. Recently, she showed me a sketch she'd been working on, a portrait of 4 generations: my grandfather, me, Michael, and herself, surrounded by books with light streaming through them. At the bottom, she'd written a quote from my grandfather: "The most valuable inheritance is the courage to protect what matters." If this story resonates with you, please tap that like button. It helps more people find these stories who might need them. Share in the comments if you've experienced family tension like this, or if you have a special connection with a grandparent who saw your true worth. Your stories matter here. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, because tomorrow I'm sharing something extra special. The moment I finally understood why Barbara was so determined to control Michael's life, and how generational patterns can be broken when we have the courage to see them clearly. Thank you for listening. Remember that true family isn't defined by last names or bloodlines, but by who stands beside you when it matters most. When the first few signs of tension appeared after Olivia started showing artistic talent, I tried to downplay them. I convinced myself Barbara's comments about balance and Harold's dismissal of creativity as a phase were just generational differences in parenting styles. I didn't want to create unnecessary conflict. Michael was thriving at his marketing firm, recently promoted to creative director, and I was busy balancing my teaching position with motherhood. We had built a comfortable life in our modest 3-bedroom home near the lake, not luxurious by Peterson standards, but perfect for us. But as Olivia grew, the comments became more pointed, more frequent. During a Thanksgiving dinner at their house when Olivia was 7, Harold made a toast to future Peterson business leaders, looking pointedly at my daughter while Barbara nodded approvingly. When Olivia announced she wanted to be an artist like me, Barbara quickly interjected that she could always run a gallery instead of just showing in one. The constant implication was clear. My influence was steering Olivia away from their vision of success. Meanwhile, my grandfather Ed was the counterbalance to their disapproval. A retired history professor who had devoted his life to education and literature, he saw Olivia's artistic sensibility as something to be nurtured, not redirected. He would visit us monthly, always bringing a book from his extensive collection, carefully chosen to spark her imagination. They would sit together for hours, Ed explaining the historical context of stories, Olivia absorbing everything with remarkable attention for a child her age. "She has the observer's eye," he told me once, watching her sketch an intricate pattern she'd noticed in one of his book's illuminated margins. "She sees what others miss. That's a rare gift, Jenny, one worth protecting." The Petersons tolerated my grandfather with stiff politeness on the rare occasions their paths crossed. To them, he was just another impractical academic, another example of the non-Peterson values they feared I was instilling in their grandchild, and, by extension, their son. They would exchange glances when he discussed literature or history at family gatherings, the kind of looks that made it clear they were enduring rather than engaging. Ed never seemed bothered by their thinly veiled disdain. "People who measure? Worth only in dollars," he once whispered to me after a particularly uncomfortable Christmas dinner, "are using a very limited yardstick." When he was diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer, Olivia was 10. Michael was supportive but distant during my grandfather's illness, not out of callousness, but from the discomfort many feel around serious illness. He would drive us to the hospital, but rarely come inside, claiming work calls or errands to run. Barbara suggested, not unkindly, that perhaps Olivia shouldn't spend so much time in that environment, as if my grandfather's illness was somehow inappropriate for a child to witness. But Olivia refused to be kept away. She showed a maturity beyond her years, reading to Ed when his vision blurred from medication, organizing his books at home when he was too tired to get out of bed, creating elaborate illustrated stories that made him laugh even on his worst days. While I coordinated his medical care and taught my classes, Olivia became his constant companion during the afternoons. What I didn't realize then was how much they were talking, really talking, during those quiet hours together. While I was dealing with insurance forms and doctor appointments, Ed was sharing his life philosophy with Olivia, teaching her about resilience, about recognizing authenticity in people, about standing firm when values are challenged. He was preparing her, I later understood, for a time when he wouldn't be there to offer guidance. "Grandpa Ed says people show you who they are if you pay attention," Olivia remarked one evening as I tucked her in. "He says you just have to watch and listen. And the truth comes out eventually." In the weeks before he died, Ed seemed to find renewed energy. He organized his papers, made phone calls to old colleagues, and spent long afternoons with Olivia in his study at his small craftsman, home near the university. I assumed they were simply enjoying their time together, perhaps working on another of their creative projects. I was too exhausted from caretaking, too worried about his declining health, to notice that something specific was being planned. After he passed, the grief was overwhelming. Olivia retreated into quiet art-making, filling sketchbooks with memories of her great-grandfather. Michael was supportive in practical ways, handling funeral arrangements, taking time off work to be home, fielding condolence calls. But emotionally, He seemed uncertain how to navigate our sadness, especially Olivia's. He had never experienced the death of someone close, and the depth of our mourning seemed to surprise him. Barbara and Harold sent an elaborate flower arrangement to the funeral, but stayed only briefly at the service, citing a charity commitment later that afternoon. Their discomfort with displays of emotion made them awkward around grief. They offered to take Olivia for a weekend to give you time to sort things out, but she refused to leave my side. A month after the funeral, Mr. Franklin, my grandfather's longtime attorney, contacted me about the will. The preliminary reading had covered the basics: Ed's modest savings, his house, some personal belongings. But there was to be a second, more formal meeting regarding the book collection, which Mr. Franklin described as requiring specific attention. The collection was substantial, over 3,000 volumes, many rare first editions, accumulated over 60 years of passionate scholarship. I knew they held monetary value, but to me their worth was entirely sentimental. These were the books I had grown up exploring, the tangible connection to my grandfather's wisdom and knowledge. I had never once considered their financial potential. The Petersons, however, immediately did. "Have you had them appraised?" Harold asked the moment he heard about the books. We were at their house for Sunday dinner, the first we'd attended since the funeral. Collections like that can be worth substantial amounts. You could be sitting on a significant asset. I haven't really thought about it that way, I admitted. They're just Grandpa's books. Well, you should think about it, Barbara interjected. Especially with college costs rising every year. Some of those first editions could fund Olivia's entire education. Michael looked interested at this perspective. Maybe we should at least get an estimate, he suggested. Just to understand what we're dealing with. I felt a flicker of unease at the sudden collective interest in my inheritance. I think Grandpa wanted them kept together, I said. He always talked about them as a unified collection, not individual items to sell. Barbara's smile tightened. That's a lovely sentiment, dear, but practicality has its place too. Edward would understand that. But I wasn't so sure. Ed had always protected his books fiercely, teaching me and later Olivia how to handle them properly, how to respect their history and integrity. He loaned volumes to serious scholars but refused generous offers to purchase even duplicates in his collection. Some things, he would say, are worth more intact than divided. The conversation shifted, but I noticed a new undercurrent in our family dynamics. Harold began sending me articles about rare book auctions. Barbara mentioned friends whose collections had sold for surprising sums. Michael started questioning our financial planning more critically, bringing up Olivia's future in ways that always seemed to circle back to the books. It was subtle at first, presented as helpful advice, practical concern, but it steadily intensified, especially after I decided to temporarily house the collection in Ed's study, which I couldn't bring myself to dismantle yet. The house itself would eventually be sold, but I wanted time to properly catalog the books before deciding their permanent home. It seems impractical to maintain two properties, Harold commented when he heard this plan. The carrying costs alone, insurance, utilities, maintenance, will eat into any potential benefit from the books. It's not about financial benefit. I tried to explain. It's about preserving something meaningful. Of course it is, Jenny, Barbara said with exaggerated patience. But meaning doesn't pay property taxes. The pressure continued to build. Michael and I began arguing about money for the first time in our marriage. Small disagreements escalated into tense silences. He started taking his parents' side more frequently, suggesting that perhaps I was being emotionally attached rather than practical. I felt increasingly isolated in my desire to honor what I believed were my grandfather's wishes. Then came the day I found Barbara and Harold in Ed's study without invitation. Olivia and I had gone over to continue our cataloging work, a project that had become our weekend ritual. My daughter had developed a meticulous system, photographing each book, recording publication information, and noting any special features or marginalia. It was healing work for both of us, a way to feel connected to Ed while processing our grief. But that Saturday, we arrived to find the Petersons already there, Harold making notes while Barbara photographed shelves with her phone. They had somehow obtained a key. Later, I discovered they had convinced Michael to give them access, just to help organize things. Their dismissal of my feelings in that moment, their assertion that I was using the inheritance to trap Michael in our marriage, was the breaking point. Not because the accusation was new, but because it was made in this sacred space, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my grandfather's legacy. What followed were tense weeks of strained relations on all fronts. Michael became increasingly distant, spending more time at work, engaging less with both me and Olivia. When he was home, he seemed preoccupied, often locked in his office making calls I wasn't privy to. I later learned some of these were consultations with financial advisors about marital assets and inheritance laws. Barbara increased her presence in our lives, scheduling more activities with Olivia, dropping by unannounced to check on things, always with an undercurrent of evaluation. She began making comments to Olivia about family traditions and Peterson, values, emphasizing bloodlines and legacy in ways that subtly excluded me. Through it all, Olivia watched and listened. She continued our weekend cataloging sessions but grew quieter, more thoughtful. She started carrying a small notebook everywhere, jotting down observations when she thought no one was looking. At the time, I assumed it was an artistic practice, perhaps sketching ideas or noting interesting visual details as I'd taught her to do. I had no idea she was documenting another kind of reality altogether. The formal notice from Mr. Franklin arrived on a Tuesday morning, requesting our presence at the final reading of specific codicils to the will. The timing felt almost orchestrated. Michael and I had argued the night before about selling the house too quickly, about his parents' increasing interference, about the fundamental question of what constituted value. It had ended with him sleeping in the guest room for the first time in our marriage. The morning of the meeting dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood. I dressed carefully in one of my more professional outfits, a navy dress I usually reserved for parent-teacher conferences, paired with my grandmother's simple pearl earrings, armor of sorts, though I didn't acknowledge it as such at the time. Olivia asked to come along, which surprised me. These legal proceedings seemed likely to be boring for a 12-year-old, but she insisted with unusual determination. I promised. Grandpa Ed, I would be there, she said simply. Michael drove separately, coming directly from work. We barely spoke when he arrived at the lawyer's office, the tension from our argument still heavy between us. Barbara and Harold were already seated in the conference room, both impeccably dressed as always. Harold reviewing papers from his leather portfolio while Barbara scrolled through her phone. Mr. Franklin welcomed us with professional courtesy, his kind eyes taking in the obvious tension in the room. He was in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful speech patterns of someone who chooses words with precision. He had been my grandfather's friend as well as his attorney, though he maintained appropriate boundaries in this professional setting. "Thank you all for coming," he began, placing a folder on the table. "As you know, Edward Wilson left specific instructions regarding his book collection, which he wanted addressed separately from the general provisions of his will." I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Part of me feared some legal complication that would force the sale of the collection. Another part hoped for clear direction that would end the ongoing conflict. "Before we begin," Mr. Franklin continued, "I should note that Edward was very specific about who should be present for this reading." He glanced at Olivia with a slight smile, including his great-granddaughter, whom he mentioned by name in his instructions. This seemed to surprise Harold, who shifted in his seat. "Is that standard procedure, having a minor present for legal matters?" "In this case, it was explicitly requested," Mr. Franklin replied, his tone making it clear the point wasn't up for debate. He opened the folder and began reviewing the basic provisions we already knew, that the collection had been left to me with the stipulation that it remain intact during my lifetime. What was new was the revelation that Ed had established a trust to cover the maintenance costs and insurance for the books, removing the financial argument for selling them. "So you see," Mr. Franklin explained, "the practical concerns about preserving the collection have been addressed." Edward was quite thorough in his planning. Barbara's lips thinned slightly at this news. Harold leaned forward. "And after Jennifer's lifetime? What happens to the collection then?" Mr. Franklin adjusted his glasses. "That's addressed in the next section of the codicil, which specifies—" That's when Olivia raised her hand, interrupting, with a politeness that still commanded attention. "Mr. Franklin," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I think this is important. Can I show everyone what Grandpa Ed gave me before he died?" The unexpected intervention created a moment of confused silence. Mr. Franklin, though clearly surprised, nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Olivia." She reached into her backpack and carefully removed a book I recognized as one of my grandfather's less valuable volumes, a worn collection of historical essays he often used in his teaching. What I didn't recognize was the slight modification to its binding, creating a hidden compartment from which Olivia extracted a sealed envelope. "He showed me this 2 weeks before he died," she explained, her eyes meeting mine briefly. "He said it was important, but that I should only share it when it was really needed." Her gaze swept across the faces at the table. "I think it's needed now." Harold made a dismissive noise, clearly viewing this as a sentimental interruption to serious business. But Mr. Franklin extended his hand with interest. "May I see that, Olivia?" She handed him the envelope, which was addressed simply, "To my family, when truth is required." As Mr. Franklin opened it and began to read silently, I watched the expressions around the table. Michael looked confused but curious. Barbara maintained perfect composure, though her fingers tapped a silent, impatient rhythm on her purse. Harold checked his watch. Mr. Franklin's eyebrows rose slightly as he read. When he finished, he looked at Olivia with newfound respect, then addressed the room. "This appears to be a letter from Edward Wilson, dated approximately 3 months before his death. It is witnessed and notarized." He adjusted his glasses. "Would you like me to read it aloud?" The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. Barbara straightened her already perfect posture. Harold's expression darkened slightly. Michael leaned forward, suddenly more engaged than he had been in weeks. I nodded, heart racing, though I wasn't sure why I felt such anticipation. "Yes, please." Mr. Franklin cleared his throat and began to read. "To my family and those concerned with material matters. If this letter is being read, it means my great-granddaughter Olivia has determined that its contents are necessary. I trust her judgment completely." Olivia sat a little straighter at these words, a quiet pride visible in her posture. "The book collection I have left to my granddaughter Jennifer is not merely a financial asset, but the physical manifestation of our family's intellectual legacy. These books have been gathered not for their monetary value, but for the knowledge and perspective they contain." Mr. Franklin continued reading, his measured voice giving weight to each word. "I have become aware of concerns regarding Jennifer's intentions for this collection, particularly from her husband's family. Let me be perfectly clear. Jennifer has never once inquired about the value of these books. Even as a child, she loved them for the worlds they contained, not for what they might be worth." I felt a lump forming in my throat as the letter continued. "In fact, it was Jennifer who refused my offer, made during my illness, to sell several valuable volumes to cover my medical expenses. Books are meant to be read and preserved, not liquidated in emergencies, she told me. We'll find another way. And she did, working extra hours teaching summer programs to help with my care. This was true. I had taken on additional classes. During summer break, teaching art at a children's museum to supplement our income when Ed's insurance didn't cover some experimental treatments. I had never told anyone, not even Michael, about my grandfather's offer to sell books. It had seemed an unnecessary burden to share when I knew I could find another solution. This is the woman some have characterized as opportunistic, Mr. Franklin read, his voice taking on a slight edge that wasn't there before. This is the woman who has been accused of using material things to secure her marriage. Nothing could be further from the truth. Barbara shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Harold's expression had hardened to granite. Michael was looking at me now, really looking, as if seeing something new. As for the eventual disposition of the collection, the letter continued, I have established a trust with specific conditions. The books will remain with Jennifer during her lifetime. Upon her passing, they will be donated to Lakeside University's Special Collections Library with a reading room established in the Wilson Peterson name. I felt a wave of relief at this provision. It was perfect. The books would be preserved intact, accessible to scholars and the public, and honored in a way that acknowledged both family lineages. However, there is one condition that must be honored, Mr. Franklin read, his tone more serious. If at any point Jennifer is pressured to sell or disperse this collection against her wishes, particularly by members of her extended family, the entire collection will immediately transfer to the university, with Jennifer remaining as its lifetime curator. The implication was clear. If the Petersons continued pushing for the books to be sold, they would lose any potential influence over their future entirely. It was a safeguard designed specifically to protect me from exactly the pressure I had been experiencing. I have discussed this arrangement with Olivia, who understands its importance. She has promised to be the guardian of this truth. Now I understood why my grandfather had involved Olivia so deliberately, why he had trusted a 12-year-old with such significant information. He had recognized in her not just artistic sensitivity, but moral clarity, an innate sense of justice that wouldn't be easily manipulated. The room fell into a heavy silence when Mr. Franklin paused. Barbara's composed facade had slipped slightly, a faint flush visible beneath her carefully applied makeup. Harold stared at his hands, jaw tight. Michael's expression was unreadable, a complex mix of emotions I couldn't interpret. There is more, Mr. Franklin said, turning to the second page. To Harold and Barbara Peterson, I have met you only a few times, but I have observed how you look at my granddaughter, how you speak about her when you think no one of consequence is listening. Let me assure you, Olivia has been listening. I have been listening. Your son, whether he acknowledges it or not, has been listening. The direct address to my in-laws was unexpected, jolting in its confrontational clarity. Barbara's flush deepened. Harold's knuckles whitened as he gripped the arm of his chair. Jennifer did not trap your son. She did not strategize to secure wealth or position through marriage. She loved him. She continues to love him, despite the wedge you persistently attempt to drive between them. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back, determined to maintain composure. I had never spoken these feelings aloud, never accused my in-laws directly of their campaign of undermining. To hear my grandfather articulate it so precisely was both validating and overwhelmingly emotional. If you value family legacy as much as you claim to value financial assets, I suggest you reconsider how you treat the mother of your grandchild. True wealth lies in relationships built on respect, not in first editions or investment portfolios. Mr. Franklin paused before reading the final paragraph, his gaze shifting briefly to Michael. And Michael, if you are present for this reading, know that your silence in the face of disrespect toward your wife has been noted. By your daughter. By me. The legacy you leave is not measured in dollars, but in the courage you show when it matters." Michael flinched visibly at these words, color rising in his face. I couldn't tell if it was anger, shame, or some combination that caused the reaction, but it was the first genuine emotion I had seen from him in weeks. "With love and hope for wisdom, Edward Wilson, Professor Emeritus of History." Mr. Franklin folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. "The document is properly witnessed and notarized. It constitutes a legally binding addition to the will." The silence that followed felt like it might never break. Barbara sat perfectly still, her social mask finally cracked to reveal genuine discomfort. Harold stared at the table, his usual confident demeanor deflated. Michael looked, stunned, as if trying to process too many revelations at once. It was Olivia who finally spoke, her voice soft but steady in the strained atmosphere. "There's one more thing," she said, reaching into her backpack again. She pulled out a small sketchbook, its covers decorated with elaborate geometric patterns she had drawn herself. She opened it to a marked page and handed it to Mr. Franklin. "I've been keeping a journal, like Grandpa Ed taught me, writing down things I hear and see. He said sometimes people don't believe something happened unless it's written down." Mr. Franklin accepted the book with evident curiosity, reading silently before passing it to Michael. My husband's expression changed as he read, moving from surprise to dismay to something that looked painfully like shame. When he finally looked up, his eyes held tears. "Mom, Dad," he said, his voice unsteady. "Is this how you've been treating Jenny? Is this what you've been saying to my daughter about her mother?" Barbara immediately began damage control. "Michael, you know how children can misunderstand adult conversations." "These are direct quotes," Olivia interrupted with a calmness that belied her age. "With dates and times. I wrote them down right after I heard them." Harold attempted to dismiss the situation. "This is ridiculous. We're discussing a serious legal matter and getting sidetracked by a child's diary." "Actually," Mr. Franklin interjected, his professional demeanor firmly in place but with steel beneath it, "what we're discussing is Edward Wilson's explicit wishes for his estate, which include protecting his granddaughter from exactly the kind of pressure documented in these notes." He closed his folder with finality. "The terms are quite clear and, frankly, quite fair. The collection remains intact with Jennifer, with provisions for its eventual preservation at the university. The trust will cover all associated costs, and any attempt to circumvent these wishes will result in immediate transfer of the collection to the university." The meeting concluded shortly after, with technical details addressed and papers signed. The walk to the parking lot was silent and tense, each of us wrapped in private thoughts. As we reached our cars, Barbara made one last attempt to reframe the situation. "We only wanted what was best for the family," she said, her voice lacking its usual polish. "These books could secure Olivia's future." Before I could respond, Olivia spoke up, addressing her grandmother directly but without anger. "Grandma Barbara," she said with surprising gentleness, "Grandpa Ed already secured my future. He taught me that some things are worth more than money. He taught me to notice when people aren't being truthful. That's worth more than any book." The wisdom in her words, the maturity with which she delivered them, left Barbara momentarily speechless. Harold placed a hand on his wife's arm, guiding her toward their car without further comment. Michael and I had driven separately, which now seemed symbolic of the distance that had grown between us. As I unlocked my car, he approached, hesitation in every step. "Can we talk?" he asked simply. "Not here, but soon?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The revelation of my grandfather's letter, of Olivia's careful documentation, of the truth we had all been dancing around for years, it was too much to process in a parking lot conversation. "I'll be home for dinner," I said finally. It wasn't a promise of resolution, but it was an opening, a possibility. As Olivia and I drove home, the rain that had threatened all day finally began to fall, gentle but persistent. We were quiet for several miles before she spoke. "Are you mad at me?" she asked, her voice small for the first time that day. "For not telling you about the letter?" I reached over and squeezed her hand. "No, sweetheart, not at all. I'm proud of you." And I was, fiercely, overwhelmingly proud of her courage, her clarity, her sense of justice. "Grandpa Ed said sometimes people need to hear the truth from someone they don't expect," she explained. "He said people listen differently when it comes from a child, or from someone who isn't there anymore." "He was right," I said, thinking of the impact his words had made, delivered posthumously and through the trust he had placed in a 12-year-old. He was right about a lot of things. We continued home through the rain, the wipers marking a steady rhythm that felt somehow like the turning of a page, the beginning of a new chapter neither of us could yet read. The drive home from Mr. Franklin's office was strangely peaceful, despite the rain pattering against the windshield. Olivia sat quietly beside me, occasionally glancing at my profile as if to gauge my reaction. The enormity of what had just happened, her revelation of my grandfather's letter, the documented evidence of the Petersons' behavior, Michael's apparent awakening, felt too complex to process while navigating wet roads and traffic signals. "Are you hungry?" I asked finally, seeking refuge in the ordinary. "Starving," she admitted. "Can we get pizza?" Some things about 12-year-olds remain blessedly constant, regardless of how mature they might seem in lawyers' offices. We stopped at Marino's, the little Italian place we'd been going to since Olivia was small enough to need a booster seat. The owner, Tony, greeted us with familiar warmth, not asking why we were dressed so formally on a Tuesday afternoon, or why my eyes looked suspiciously red-rimmed. We ordered our usual, half mushroom for me, half pepperoni for Olivia, and settled into a booth near the back. The restaurant was nearly empty at this odd hour between lunch and dinner. Just a couple of college students hunched over laptops and an elderly man reading a newspaper at the counter. "So," I said, once Tony had brought our sodas and retreated, "you and Grandpa Ed had quite a plan." Olivia traced patterns in the condensation on her glass. "He said there would be a moment when the books became a problem. He knew before any of us did." "How?" I wondered aloud. "He barely spent any time with the Petersons." "That's why he could see it clearly," she replied with startling insight. "He wasn't caught up in trying to make them like him. He just watched how they acted, especially when they thought no one important was paying attention." The phrase from the letter, "when they think no one of consequence is listening," echoed in my mind. It was precisely this dismissal that had allowed both Ed and Olivia to observe what I, in my desperate desire for acceptance, had often excused or rationalized. "When did he show you the hiding place in the book?" I asked. 2 weeks before he died. We were organizing his study, and he showed me his secret compartment books. He had 3 of them. She smiled at the memory. "He said sometimes the most important words need to be hidden inside other words until the right moment." Our pizza arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. As we ate, I considered the full weight of what my grandfather had entrusted to a child. Not just a letter, but the timing of its revelation, the judgment of when that truth was needed. He had recognized something in Olivia that many adults missed: her unwavering moral compass, her capacity to observe without the filters that social conditioning imposes on most adults. "Were you scared today? To speak up in front of everyone?" I asked. She considered the question seriously, chewing thoughtfully before answering. "Not scared exactly. More determined. Like when you know something needs to be done even if it's hard." She looked down at her plate. I didn't like seeing Dad read my journal, though. That part was uncomfortable. "Your journal," I repeated, realization dawning. "That's what you've been writing in these past few months, not just sketches." She nodded. Grandpa Ed said it's important to write down what really happens, not just what people say happened later. He said history depends on accurate records. My throat tightened with emotion, pride, gratitude, and a touch of sadness that my grandfather had felt the need to prepare a child for this role. You know, most kids your age wouldn't understand the importance of that. Most kids my age don't have great-grandfathers who were history professors, she countered with a small smile. Or in-laws like the Petersons. I nearly choked on my pizza at her matter-of-fact assessment. Olivia, what? It's true. She shrugged, suddenly every inch a preteen. They're nice sometimes, but they've never really liked you, and they think I'm too much like you. I'm not blind, Mom. The simplicity of her perception was disarming. While I had spent years contorting myself to earn their approval, making excuses for their behavior, my daughter had simply seen the situation for what it was. No, I agreed softly. You're definitely not blind. We finished our meal in companionable silence, both lost in our own thoughts. The rain had intensified by the time we left, fat drops splattering against the sidewalk as we made a dash for the car. The rhythmic sweep of the wipers accompanied us home, where we found Michael's car already in the driveway, much earlier than his usual return time. He was sitting on the covered porch, still in his work clothes, but with his tie loosened and collar unbuttoned. He looked up as we approached, his expression a complex mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. I left the office early, he explained unnecessarily. I've been thinking about what happened today, about what was in that letter and in Olivia's journal. Olivia glanced between us, clearly sensing the need for adult conversation. I have homework, she announced diplomatically. I'll be in my room. She squeezed past Michael with a small, encouraging smile, leaving us alone on the porch as the rain created a silver curtain around the covered space. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the awkwardness between us unfamiliar after years of easy communication. I had no idea, Michael finally said, his voice low, about what they've been saying to Olivia, about how they've made you feel. I leaned against the porch railing, studying his face. I tried to tell you, Michael, many times. I know, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. But I didn't really hear you. Or I dismissed it as just normal family tension, the kind everyone deals with. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. I didn't want to see it. The honesty in his admission was disarming. For years, I had interpreted his failure to defend me as tacit agreement with his parents, as evidence that perhaps they were right, about me after all. But the man before me now looked genuinely shaken, as if the foundations of his understanding had been disrupted. Why? I asked simply. He was quiet for a long moment, organizing his thoughts. It's complicated, he began. My parents have always been imposing. Growing up, their approval was everything. When I disappointed them, which was often, it felt devastating. When I pleased them, it felt like winning an Olympic medal. He smiled ruefully. Not exactly the healthiest dynamic. No, I agreed. But we're not children anymore, Michael. I've been your wife for 8 years. Olivia's mother. Your partner. I know, he said again, more heavily this time. When I read what they'd been saying, what Olivia had written down. He shook his head. I was ashamed. Not just of them, but of myself. For allowing it. For pretending not to notice. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the porch, creating a cocoon of white noise around our conversation. A neighbor walked by with a dog, huddled under an umbrella, barely visible, through the downpour. What your grandfather wrote about me, about my silence, it was true, Michael continued. I've been a coward, taking the path of least resistance, trying to keep everyone happy instead of standing up for what's right. And now? I asked, not wanting to make this too easy for him, needing to hear more than just recognition of past failures. Now I see what it's cost us, what it's been teaching Olivia. His voice caught slightly. She shouldn't have had to be the one to speak the truth. That should have been me. I moved to sit beside him on the porch swing, close but not touching. "It's not too late," I said quietly, "to choose differently." He reached for my hand tentatively, and I let him take it, feeling the familiar contours of his fingers intertwining with mine. "I want to," he said, "but I need to know if you still believe in us, in me." It was a fair question. The past few months had eroded something essential between us. Trust, perhaps, or the belief that when it mattered most, we would choose each other above all else. But sitting there, watching him struggle with genuine remorse, I felt a cautious hope stirring. "I believe in the man you can be," I answered honestly. "The one who puts his family first, who values what really matters." I squeezed his hand. "I've always seen that man in you, even when he's been hiding." The relief in his eyes was palpable, though I could tell he understood this wasn't an immediate restoration, but the beginning of a longer process of rebuilding. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain, holding hands like we used to in the early days of our relationship. "They're coming for dinner tomorrow night," he said eventually. I stiffened. "Your parents?" "Michael, I don't think—" "I need to talk to them," he interrupted gently. "With you there. About boundaries. About respect. About what happens if they want to remain part of our lives, and Olivia's." The determination in his voice was new, or perhaps not new, but long dormant. This was the Michael who had stood up to his senior partner when a client wanted an ethically questionable campaign. The Michael who had taken a pay cut to work. With more socially responsible companies, the Michael I had fallen in love with. "Okay," I agreed, somewhat warily, "but Olivia doesn't need to be there for that conversation." "Agreed. I'll ask Amanda if Olivia can have dinner at their place. She and Sophia have that science project to work on anyway." He hesitated. "And I think we should move the books here, to our house. Set up a proper space for them. Not to keep them away from my parents, but to honor what they really mean to you and Olivia." The suggestion took me by surprise, not because it wasn't logical, but because it represented such a clear alignment with what mattered to me rather than what his parents would prefer. "That would be wonderful," I said softly. "Olivia would love that." The following day passed in a blur of ordinary activities: teaching my classes, helping Olivia with homework, grading student projects. Michael called twice from work, small gestures of connection that felt significant after weeks of distance. We didn't discuss the impending dinner directly, but there was an undercurrent of nervous energy in our text exchanges, a shared awareness that something important was about to shift. When I picked Olivia up from school, she immediately asked about the evening's plans. "Are you and Dad going to be okay with them coming over after yesterday?" Her concern touched me. "We'll be fine, sweetheart. Actually, you'll be having dinner with Sophia and her family tonight. Dad and I need to have an adult conversation with Grandma and Grandpa Peterson." She studied my face with that perceptive gaze that sometimes made me forget she was only 12. "Good adult conversation or bad adult conversation?" "Necessary adult conversation," I replied honestly. "Your dad is going to set some boundaries that are long overdue." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. "He needs to use his conference room voice," she said decisively. When I looked puzzled, she explained, "You know, the one he uses when he calls important clients. All confident and no nonsense." I laughed despite my nerves. That's exactly the voice he needs. By 6:30, our house was filled with competing aromas. The lasagna I'd prepared, a neutral choice, neither too casual nor too formal, fresh, garlic bread, and the subtle scent of the flowers Michael had surprised me with when he came home early to help prepare. Olivia had already been dropped off at Amanda's after extracting a promise that we would tell her everything important when she returned. The Petersons arrived precisely at 7, punctual as always. Barbara carried a bottle of wine that I recognized as significantly more expensive than what we usually served, while Harold clutched a small gift bag that likely contained something equally calculated to remind us of the financial gap between our households. Their greeting was subdued, lacking the usual confident energy they typically brought into our home. Barbara air-kissed my cheek without quite making contact, while Harold offered a stiff handshake to Michael before nodding tersely in my direction. "Where's Olivia?" Barbara asked immediately, glancing around the living room. "She's having dinner with a friend tonight," Michael answered, his voice casual but firm. "We wanted to speak with you both privately." A flicker of unease crossed their faces at this announcement. Without Olivia present, there would be no buffer of polite conversation about school activities or her latest art projects, just the four of us and the uncomfortable truths that had been exposed the day before. "I see," Harold said, his tone carefully neutral. "Well, the wine needs to breathe anyway." He handed the bottle to Michael with the air of someone performing a familiar ritual, seeking comfort in routine. We moved to the dining room, where I had set the table with our nicest dishes, not to impress them, but to signal the importance of the conversation to come. Michael took the head of the table, with me to his right, while his parents sat opposite me. The unusual seating arrangement wasn't lost on them. Typically, Harold would have taken the dominant position. The first few minutes were filled with mundane conversation, comments about the weather, a brief mention of traffic on the drive over. Barbara complimented the table setting with the slightly surprised tone she often used when acknowledging my domestic efforts, as if continually amazed that an art teacher could also set a proper table. It wasn't until I served the lasagna that Michael cleared his throat, signaling a shift in the evening's tenor. "Mom, Dad," he began, his voice indeed carrying that professional authority Olivia had described. "We need to talk about what happened yesterday, about Grandpa Ed's letter and about Olivia's journal." Barbara immediately adopted a dismissive expression. "Michael, surely you understand that was just a misunderstanding, an old man's paranoia and a child's imagination." "No," Michael interrupted firmly. "It wasn't." He placed his napkin beside his plate, focusing entirely on the conversation. "I've spent the last 24 hours reflecting on this, reviewing years of interactions, the way you've spoken to and about Jenny, the subtle and not-so-subtle criticisms, the undermining comments, the constant implication that she somehow trapped me, or that our marriage is less than what it should be." Harold attempted to interject, but Michael held up a hand. "Please, let me finish." The unusual assertiveness from their typically compliant son seemed to startle them into silence. "Yesterday was illuminating for me," he continued, "not just because of what was revealed, but because it made me confront my own role in allowing this situation. I've been silent when I should have spoken up. I've avoided conflict instead of defending my wife. I've prioritized your approval over the well-being of my marriage." I watched Michael as he spoke, seeing a strength and clarity I'd missed in recent months. It was as if the fog of confusion and divided loyalties had finally lifted, allowing him to see the situation and his own responsibility with perfect clarity. "That ends today," he stated, making direct eye contact with each of his parents in turn. "Jenny is my wife, my partner, the mother of my child, and from now on, she will be treated with the respect she deserves in this family. No more subtle digs, no more dismissive comments about her career, no more implications about her motives or character." Barbara's face had paled slightly, while Harold's had taken on a defensive rigidity. The lasagna sat untouched on their plates, steam slowly dissipating in the charged atmosphere. "Michael," Barbara began, her voice taking on the reasonable, slightly patronizing tone she often employed in difficult conversations. "You know we only want what's best for you and Olivia. If anything we've said has been misinterpreted, it hasn't been misinterpreted," I interjected quietly but firmly. It was the first time I'd directly challenged her characterization of events, and the surprise on her face was evident. "You've made it clear from the beginning that you don't think I'm good enough for your son, that my career isn't prestigious enough, that my family background isn't advantageous enough, that I'm somehow benefiting more from this marriage than Michael is." Harold shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Jennifer, that's not fair." "Actually, it is fair," Michael interrupted. "It's entirely fair, and it's accurate." He reached for my hand across the table, a public display of unity. "I've reviewed Olivia's journal. She's documented specific comments, with dates and contexts. Comments about Jenny latching onto Peterson connections. About how I could have done better if I'd waited. About how the inheritance from Ed was convenient timing to keep me on the hook. The direct quotations hung in the air like physical objects, impossible to dismiss or reinterpret. Barbara's carefully composed facade cracked slightly, a flush of embarrassment rising in her cheeks. Harold stared at his plate, jaw working silently. "We didn't realize Olivia was listening," Barbara finally said, as if this were the primary issue. "That's not the point," Michael replied, his voice softening slightly but remaining firm. "The point is that you said these things at all. That you've been thinking them, believing them, acting on them for years." He leaned forward. "The point is that they're wrong." For perhaps the first time since I'd known them, the Petersons seemed genuinely at a loss. The familiar scripts of polite deflection and subtle redirection weren't working. The unspoken family rule that certain truths remained tactfully unacknowledged had been irrevocably broken. "We had concerns," Harold finally admitted, his voice gruff. "When you married so quickly to someone so different from what we'd expected for you." "I didn't marry who you expected," Michael acknowledged. "I married who I loved, who I still love." "And the books?" Barbara asked, abruptly changing tack. "You have to admit, it's an unusual situation, Jennifer inheriting such valuable items right when you two were having financial discussions about Olivia's education fund." I felt a flash of indignation at the implication, but Michael spoke before I could respond. "Mom," he said with surprising gentleness, "there was no calculation there. Jenny had no idea what was in Ed's will. In fact," he glanced at me apologetically, "I'm the one who brought up selling some of the books. Not because we needed the money, but because I thought it was the practical thing to do. Jenny was the one who insisted on respecting her grandfather's wishes." This admission surprised me. We hadn't discussed this part of the conversation yet, and I realized there were aspects of Michael's thinking I hadn't fully understood. "The books were never about money for Jenny or for Ed," Michael continued. "They represent something else, entirely. Knowledge, legacy, the joy of learning for its own sake. Values that, frankly, our family could benefit from appreciating more." The straightforward critique of Peterson family values was unprecedented, and I could see it land like a physical blow. Harold straightened in his chair, chest expanding slightly as if preparing for a confrontation, while Barbara's lips pressed into a thin line. "So what are you saying exactly?" Harold asked, his voice taking on the clipped tone he used in business disagreements. "That we're not welcome in your lives anymore? That one uncomfortable incident means decades of family connection are severed?" "No," Michael replied calmly. "I'm saying that if you want to remain close to us, to Olivia, things need to change, fundamentally and permanently." He outlined clear boundaries with remarkable precision. No more unsolicited financial advice, no more undermining comments about my career or background. No more attempts to shape Olivia according to their expectations, rather than respecting her own interests and talents. "And most importantly," he concluded, "you need to genuinely accept Jenny as my wife, not tolerate her, not endure her presence. Accept her, with respect, and eventually, with affection." because she is the woman I have chosen to build my life with, and that isn't changing." The directness of his statement hung in the air between us. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, surprisingly, it was Barbara who broke the silence. "May I use your restroom?" she asked, her voice unusually subdued. I directed her to the guest bathroom, watching as she walked away with uncharacteristically rigid posture. When she was out of earshot, Harold leaned toward his son. "You're asking for a significant adjustment," he said, his tone more candid than I'd ever heard it. "One that won't happen overnight." "I know," Michael acknowledged, "but it needs to start now, tonight, and it needs to be sincere." Harold studied his son's face, seeing perhaps for the first time the man he had become rather than the boy he had raised. "You really do love her," he said, almost wonderingly, as if this possibility had never fully registered before. "More than you've ever understood," Michael confirmed. "And Olivia adores her. She's an exceptional mother, a gifted teacher, and she challenges me to be better in ways that have nothing to do with career advancement or financial portfolios." I felt tears threatening at this unexpected defense, this public declaration of value. For years, I had quietly absorbed the suggestion that I brought less to our marriage than Michael did, that the benefits were unequally distributed. To hear him articulate so clearly what I meant to him, especially to his father, was profoundly moving. Barbara returned, her composure restored, but with a subdued quality to her movements. She had clearly been crying, though her makeup remained impeccable. She sat down carefully, placing her napkin in her lap with deliberate movements. "I think," she said, addressing me directly for perhaps the first time that evening, "that we should start over with the meal. It's getting cold," and Jennifer clearly went to considerable effort. It was a small gesture, almost absurdly inadequate given the magnitude of the conversation we were having. But I recognized it for what it was. An acknowledgement, however, tentative that something needed to change. Not agreement, not yet acceptance, but a willingness to pause and reconsider. We ate in relative silence for a few minutes, the tension gradually diffusing into something more complex but less immediately threatening. Eventually, Barbara spoke again, her voice carefully modulated. "The reading room at the university," she said, "the one Edward mentioned in his letter. It's a thoughtful legacy." "It is," I agreed cautiously. "Perhaps," she continued, glancing at Harold as if seeking confirmation, "we could contribute to the endowment, to ensure it's properly maintained." She smoothed her napkin unnecessarily. "As a family project, the Wilson-Peterson reading room should represent both sides after all." The offer caught me by surprise, not just the financial aspect, which was significant, but the implicit acknowledgement of a shared legacy, a connection between our families that transcended the tensions of the past. That would be... I searched for the right word, settling finally on simple truth. "That would be wonderful, Barbara. Especially for Olivia." Michael reached for my hand again, squeezing it gently in silent support. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by his parents, who exchanged a glance I couldn't quite interpret. "We should discuss the logistics," Harold said, shifting into the practical mode that was clearly more comfortable for him than emotional reconciliation. "Tax implications, naming rights, university protocols." "We have time for that," Michael suggested. "Tonight, maybe we could just focus on understanding each other better." It was an invitation to something deeper than financial arrangements or public gestures. For a moment, I thought Harold might dismiss it, retreat to the safety of concrete plans and measurable outcomes. But instead, he nodded slightly, setting down his fork with deliberate care. "Tell us then," he said, looking directly at me. "What was Edward like as a grandfather? What made these books so important to him and to you?" It was the first genuine question about my family he had ever asked, the first indication of interest. in understanding rather than evaluating. I took a deep breath and began to share stories about my grandfather, his passion for knowledge, his belief in education as a pathway to empathy, the quiet afternoons I'd spent in his study as a child, while he explained the significance of different volumes. As I spoke, something subtle shifted in the room's atmosphere. Not a dramatic transformation, not an immediate healing of years of subtle wounds, but a crack in the wall that had separated us, a small opening where understanding might eventually grow. The evening ended earlier than usual, the emotional weight of our conversation having exhausted everyone. At the door, Barbara hesitated, then did something unprecedented. She hugged me. Not the formal, barely touching embrace she typically offered, but a genuine, if awkward, attempt at connection. "We'll do better," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. "It might take time, but we'll try." It wasn't an apology, not explicitly, but it was an acknowledgement, a promise of effort that felt more honest than any elaborate expression of regret might have. After they left, Michael and I stood in the kitchen, cleaning up in companionable silence. The events of the past 2 days had shifted something fundamental between us, restored a connection that had been fraying without either of us fully acknowledging it. "What you said to your father," I began, rinsing a plate before placing it in the dishwasher. "About loving me, about what I bring to our marriage. Did you mean it?" Michael paused in drying a serving dish, setting it down to turn to me fully. "Every word," he said simply. "I'm sorry it took a 12-year-old's journal and a posthumous letter to make me say it aloud. Grandpa Ed would say timing doesn't matter as much as truth," I replied, smiling slightly at the memory of one of his favorite sayings. "He was a wise man," Michael acknowledged, "especially about people. That's why he trusted Olivia with the letter," I realized aloud. He saw in her what he saw in himself, that observer's eye, the ability to recognize truth beneath surfaces. We finished cleaning in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Later, when we picked up Olivia from Amanda's house, she studied our faces intently from the back seat, clearly looking for clues about how the dinner had gone. "Did you use your conference room voice?" she asked Michael directly. He laughed, surprised. "I did, actually. How did you know that's what I needed?" She shrugged with the casual confidence of someone who has been proven right. It was obvious. Regular dad voice wouldn't work with Grandpa Harold. He only respects people who sound like they're in charge. The insightful assessment of her grandfather's psychology was so accurate, so succinctly expressed, that Michael and I exchanged astonished glances. "So?" Olivia prompted. "What happened?" "We set some boundaries," Michael explained, "about how they treat Mom and you and our families' choices. And they agreed?" Her skepticism was evident. "They're going to try," I said honestly. "It's a starting point, not a finished journey." Olivia considered this, nodding slowly. "Grandpa Ed would say that's how most important changes work. Small steps in the right direction, not big dramatic leaps." As we drove home through the quiet streets of Lakeside, I reflected on how thoroughly my grandfather's wisdom had been absorbed by my daughter, how his influence would continue to shape her long after his physical presence was gone. It was a different kind of inheritance than the books, more subtle, more profound, and ultimately more valuable. The following weekend, we began moving the book collection to our house, transforming the rarely used formal dining room into a home library. Michael installed proper shelving, carefully designed to accommodate the varying sizes and conditions of the volumes. Olivia created a cataloging system, complete with color-coded labels and a digital database that would have impressed my grandfather with its thoroughness. Barbara and Harold didn't participate in the physical move. That boundary still felt necessary, but they did send a check toward the university endowment. along with a handwritten note expressing their commitment to honoring both family legacies. It was a modest beginning, tentative and imperfect, but genuine. One evening, as the three of us worked together arranging books on their new shelves, Olivia paused with a volume in her hands, the modified book that had contained my grandfather's letter. "There are 2 more, you know," she said casually. 2 more hidden compartment books. Michael and I both looked up, surprised. "What's in them?" I asked. Olivia smiled, a small, secretive expression that reminded me powerfully of my grandfather. "More letters," she said. But Grandpa Ed was very clear about when they should be revealed. "And when is that?" Michael asked, curious. "When they're needed," she replied simply, returning to her cataloging with serene confidence. "Don't worry, I'll know." Looking at her, this remarkable child who had found the courage to speak truth to power, who carried my grandfather's wisdom, and her father's growing strength alongside her own unique gifts, I believed her completely. Whatever those letters contained, whatever wisdom my grandfather had preserved for future moments of need, they were in exactly the right hands. The books found their proper places on our shelves, not as financial assets or bargaining chips, but as physical manifestations of something far more valuable, the intellectual and moral legacy that connected our past to our future. And in arranging them, in creating a space where they could be properly honored, we were also arranging a new understanding of family, of value, of what it means to truly see one another across the divisions of expectation and assumption. It wasn't a perfect resolution. The Petersons would still struggle sometimes with old habits. Michael would occasionally falter in maintaining boundaries, and I would have moments of doubt about my place in their world. But something fundamental had shifted. A truth had been spoken that couldn't be unheard, and in that truth we had found a pathway forward, through an old man's foresight, a child's courage, and the enduring power of words preserved between covers, waiting for the moment when they would be most needed. 6 months passed, bringing autumn to Lakeside with its brilliant tapestry of red and gold leaves that transformed our neighborhood. The season felt symbolic, a time of beautiful transition after the stormy confrontation that had reset the foundations of our family relationships. While the changes with the Petersons weren't dramatic or instantaneous, they were steady and genuine, like a gradual tide shifting direction. The home library had become the heart of our house, with the book collection properly installed on custom shelving that Michael had insisted on building himself, a labor of love that surprised me with its craftsmanship. He'd spent weekends researching proper preservation techniques, consulting with university archivists, and creating an environment that would protect the volumes while making them accessible. It was his way of demonstrating commitment, of honoring something that mattered deeply to me without needing to be convinced of its monetary value. Olivia had taken over a corner of the room, setting up her art supplies near the window where northern light provided perfect illumination for her increasingly sophisticated drawings. She'd begun a series of illustrations inspired by literary scenes from her favorite books in the collection, remarkable interpretations that blended her artistic vision with the written works. One particularly golden October afternoon, I was grading student portfolios at the library's reading table when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting visitors, and Michael was at a weekend marketing conference in Chicago. Opening the door revealed Barbara standing alone on our porch, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper and looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her usual confidence subdued. I was in the neighborhood and thought I might stop by. This was already a departure from past patterns. Barbara never happened to be in the neighborhood. Her visits were always planned, announced, and generally coordinated with Harold's schedule. For her to arrive alone, unannounced, signaled something significant. "Not at all," I said, stepping back to welcome her in. "I was just grading some student work. Would you like some tea?" She nodded, following me to the kitchen where I put the kettle on and arranged some cookies on a plate. Simple domestic rituals that had always seemed to fall short of Barbara's standards in the past. Today, however, she watched my movements with a different kind of attention, almost studying me. "Where's Olivia?" she asked, accepting the mug I offered. "At her art class," I explained. "She's taking an advanced drawing workshop at the community center on Saturday afternoons." "She's very talented," Barbara said, a simple observation, without the usual addendum about balancing artistic pursuits with more practical studies. "Harold and I went to the school art show last month. Her portrait of Edward was quite moving." The acknowledgement surprised me. Olivia had indeed created a striking portrait of my grandfather for her school's exhibition, working from photographs and memory to capture not just his appearance, but something of his spirit. The thoughtful gaze, the hint of humor around his mouth, the intelligence in his eyes. I hadn't realized the Petersons had attended the show. They hadn't mentioned it during our now regular Sunday dinners. "Thank you," I said simply. That would mean a lot to her. Barbara ran her finger along the rim of her mug, a nervous gesture I'd never observed in her before. "I've been doing some thinking," she said finally, "about family, about connections, about what really matters in the long run." She reached for the package she'd brought, placing it carefully on the kitchen table between us. "This is for you, or rather, for the collection." Curious, I unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a book. Not just any book, but a first edition. Of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, its blue cloth binding slightly faded but in remarkable condition. "Barbara," I breathed, carefully opening the cover to examine the publication information. This is extraordinary." "It belonged to my grandmother," she said, watching my reaction carefully. "She was an English teacher before she married my grandfather. Not many people know that about our family history." This revelation was startling. In all the years I'd known the Petersons, their family narratives had centered on business achievements, financial acumen, and social connections. The existence of an educator in their lineage, particularly one whose professional identity had apparently been subsumed by marriage, had never been mentioned. "She had to give up teaching after the wedding, of course," Barbara continued, a note of something complex in her voice. "That was how things were done then. But she kept her books, and she read to my father every night. This was one of her favorites." I handled the volume with appropriate reverence, noting the careful pencil annotations in the margins. Another woman's thoughts, preserved alongside Woolf's words about the necessity of financial independence and personal space for women's creative fulfillment. "I never knew her," Barbara said, stirring her tea unnecessarily. "She died before I was born, but my father always said I inherited her determination." A small smile touched her lips. I think he meant stubbornness. "It belongs in a university archive," I said honestly, reluctant to accept such a valuable gift despite its perfect fit with our collection. "It belongs with people who understand its worth beyond its auction value," Barbara corrected gently. I think Edward would agree with that assessment. The invocation of my grandfather's name was deliberate, an acknowledgement of shared values that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I thanked her with genuine emotion, and we fell into a surprisingly comfortable conversation about books that had shaped our lives, discovering unexpected common ground in our appreciation for women authors who had pushed against societal constraints. As Barbara was preparing to leave, she paused in the entryway, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I wanted to tell you something," she said finally. "Michael doesn't know this, and I'd prefer he didn't, at least not yet. But I think you should understand." I waited, curious about this unexpected, confidential tone from a woman who had always kept me at a careful distance. "When Michael first told us about you, I was unhappy," she admitted. "Not because of anything about you personally, but because it wasn't what I'd planned for him. We had always assumed he would marry someone, like Elise, someone from our social circle, someone whose background and expectations matched ours. This wasn't news, but her willingness to acknowledge it openly was unprecedented. The truth is, she continued, I was afraid you would take him away from us. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. That he would choose your values, your perspectives, your approach to life instead of what we'd worked so hard to instill in him. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve, a habitual gesture of self-composure. And in a way, I was right. He did choose differently. But what I didn't understand then was that it wasn't a rejection of us. It was him becoming fully himself. The insight was profound, especially coming from a woman who had spent years subtly undermining my place in her son's life. Why are you telling me this now? I asked gently. Because I owe you an apology, she said directly, meeting my eyes with unexpected humility. Not just for how I've treated you, but for not seeing who you really are, for assuming your different choices meant lesser values. She glanced toward our library, visible through the open door. Edward's letter forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself, about how Harold and I have defined success and worth. It's not easy to realize you've been measuring the wrong things for most of your life. Before I could respond to this extraordinary admission, the front door opened, and Olivia burst in with her usual after-class energy, art portfolio tucked under her arm and cheeks flushed from the autumn air. "Grandma Barbara!" she exclaimed, genuinely pleased by the unexpected visitor. "Did you come to see the library? It's almost finished." The moment of vulnerability between Barbara and me shifted as she turned to her granddaughter with a warm smile that had once seemed reserved for more suitable members of the Peterson circle. "I brought a book for the collection," she explained. "Something that belonged to your great-great-grandmother Peterson." Olivia's eyes widened with interest. "Another family connection. That's perfect for the reading room at the university. Our families together in one place." Her innocent framing of our merged legacies brought a soft expression to Barbara's face. "Yes," she agreed quietly. "Together." After Barbara left, Olivia examined the Wolf volume with appropriate care, turning pages delicately as she studied the marginal notes. "She's different now," she observed casually, not looking up from the book. "In what way?" I asked, curious about my daughter's perception. "She listens more. Really listens, not just waiting for her turn to talk." Olivia traced a finger along a particularly dense passage of annotations. "And she looks at you differently, like she's trying to figure something out." As always, her observation was incisive. Barbara had indeed been watching me with a new attentiveness in recent months, as if reassessing a painting she'd previously dismissed without proper examination. "People can change," I suggested, "when they're willing to see things differently." "Grandpa Ed said that's the hardest thing for humans to do," Olivia replied thoughtfully. "To admit they've been wrong about something important. He said it takes more courage than facing physical danger." When Michael returned from his conference the following day, I showed him the book Barbara had brought, explaining the story of his great-grandmother, the English teacher. To my surprise, he looked genuinely shocked. "I never knew that," he admitted, carefully examining the volume. "Mom never mentioned having an educator in the family. It was always business achievements, political connections, financial successes. Maybe she didn't know the full story either," I suggested. "Or maybe it didn't fit the narrative she thought was important." Michael considered this, turning the book in his hands. "It's strange to think about the parts of our own history that get edited out, because they don't match the story we want to tell about ourselves." The observation was unexpectedly philosophical, revealing a reflectiveness that had been emerging more frequently since the confrontation 6 months earlier. Michael had been doing his own personal work, examining the values he'd internalized and questioning which ones truly served the life he wanted to build. "She's making an effort," he noted, returning to the subject of his mother. They both are, in their own ways. It was true. Harold's approach had been more practical, offering financial expertise for the university endowment, connecting us with a specialist in book preservation, respecting boundaries without requiring emotional discussions. Barbara's had been more personal, with genuine attempts to understand my work as an educator and to support Olivia's artistic development without trying to redirect it. 2 weeks later, an unexpected package arrived from New York, a first edition of John Dewey's Art as Experience, sent by Harold with a brief note. Found this at an estate sale. Thought it might complement Edward's collection. The author's educational philosophy seems aligned with your approach to teaching. The acknowledgement of my pedagogical values, coming from a man who had once dismissed teaching art as a hobby, was significant. The book itself was a thoughtful selection, demonstrating research into both my grandfather's collection and my own professional interests. Michael and I added it to the shelves with appropriate ceremony, Olivia insisting on creating a special bookplate that acknowledged the Peterson Wilson collection with elegant calligraphy. As Thanksgiving approached, we faced the traditional question of holiday arrangements. In previous years, dinner had always been at the Peterson home. Formal, somewhat rigid affairs with prescribed menus and careful conversation. This year, however, felt different. The power dynamics had shifted, and with them, the unspoken rules of family engagement. I'd like to host Thanksgiving this year, I told Michael one evening as we prepared dinner together, a domestic ritual that had become more collaborative since our reconciliation, here, in our home. He looked up from chopping vegetables, surprised but not dismissive. That would be a big change from tradition. I know, I acknowledged, but maybe it's time for some new traditions, ones that blend both families' approaches. Michael considered this, the knife pausing in its rhythm. Mom might struggle with giving up control of the menu, he said honestly. It's been her domain for decades. What if we invited her to collaborate? I suggested. She could bring certain dishes, I could prepare others. A true merging rather than a transfer of authority. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. He smiled, resuming his chopping with renewed energy. It's worth asking. The worst she can say is no. To my surprise, when Michael extended the invitation, Barbara not only accepted but seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the arrangement. I've been wanting to try a new cranberry relish recipe, she confided during our planning call. Harold always insists on the traditional one his mother made, but this might be the perfect opportunity to introduce something different. The symbolic weight of her willingness to deviate from Peterson traditions wasn't lost on either of us. What followed was a series of unexpectedly enjoyable planning conversations, with Barbara offering suggestions rather than directives, and me incorporating elements of both families' holiday customs into the menu and decor. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold, with morning frost silvering the lawn and bare tree branches. I had risen early to begin preparations, enjoying the quiet house before the day's festivities began. The dining table had been moved into the library for the occasion, surrounded by the books that had become such a central part of our family narrative, physical reminders of the legacy that connected generations. Barbara and Harold arrived precisely, on time, arms laden with carefully packed dishes and a bottle of wine selected specifically to pair with the meal. The initial moments held a hint of awkwardness. This was, after all, the first major holiday where the established power structure had been explicitly rearranged. But it dissipated quickly as we settled into the practical tasks of final preparations. What struck me most throughout the day was how differently we all moved in relation to one another. Harold engaged Olivia in a genuine conversation about her art, asking insightful questions about her technique without any subtle redirections toward more practical pursuits. Barbara and I worked together in the kitchen with a comfortable rhythm that would have been unimaginable a year earlier, sharing space and responsibilities without tension. Michael watched these interactions with quiet satisfaction, occasionally catching my eye across the room with a small nod of acknowledgement. This was what we had hoped for, but hadn't been certain was possible. Not perfect harmony, but authentic connection based on mutual respect rather than obligatory tolerance. As we gathered around the table, surrounded by the books that had catalyzed our family's transformation, Harold surprised us by requesting to offer the blessing, another departure from tradition, as Michael had always performed this role at his parents' insistence. "If I may," Harold began, uncharacteristically hesitant, "I'd like to express gratitude not just for the food and prosperity, but for the lessons of this past year." He cleared his throat, visibly moving beyond his comfort zone, "for the courage to speak truth, the wisdom to recognize it, and the humility to accept it, even when it challenges long-held beliefs." Barbara reached for his hand, her eyes suspiciously bright. Olivia watched with the careful attention she brought to all significant moments, mentally recording another page in the family history she was witnessing and helping to create. "To Edward Wilson," Harold continued, raising his glass slightly, "whose foresight and wisdom continue to guide this family, and to Olivia, whose courage reminded us all that the youngest among us often see most clearly." The acknowledgement brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Harold had never mentioned my grandfather by name in this way, had never explicitly credited him or Olivia with the insights that had reshaped our family dynamics. The meal that followed was unlike any previous family gathering, relaxed, genuine, punctuated by actual laughter rather than polite social chuckles. Conversation flowed naturally, touching on art, literature, Michael's work, my teaching, and Olivia's latest creative projects. When Barbara mentioned a community arts initiative she'd recently joined as a volunteer, I realized how much of her own identity had been subsumed by the Peterson family image, how she too had been constrained by the narrow definitions of success and value that had shaped their world. After dinner, as we lingered over coffee and dessert, Olivia excused herself briefly, returning with her sketchbook clutched to her chest. "I've been working on something," she announced with uncharacteristic shyness. "For today." She opened the book to reveal a detailed drawing of all 5 of us, seated around a table surrounded by books. The setting was clearly our library, but the perspective was unusual, as if viewed from above, allowing the viewer to see not just our faces but the spines of the books that encircled us. Among the titles I recognized from our collection, Olivia had included Barbara's grandmother's Wolf volume and Harold's Dewey contribution, alongside my grandfather's most treasured first editions. "It's for the reading room at the university," she explained. "Mr. Franklin said they want some artwork for the walls to show the family connection to the books. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the deliberate inclusion of both lineages in her representation of our shared legacy, created a moment of silent appreciation around the table." Harold studied the drawing with evident emotion, while Barbara touched the image of her grandmother's book with gentle fingers. "You've captured us," she said softly. "All of us, together." It was precisely the right observation. Olivia had, indeed, captured not just our physical likenesses, but the new reality of our family's interconnection. The ways in which separate strands of history and value had been woven into something stronger and more complex than either could be alone. Later that evening, after the Petersons had departed and Olivia had gone to bed, Michael and I stood in the library, tidying the last remnants of our celebration. The shelves of books surrounded us like silent witnesses to the year's transformation, tangible reminders of the power of preserved words to bridge time and understanding. "I keep thinking about that second letter," Michael said, carefully returning a reference volume to its proper place. "The one Olivia mentioned. Do you think we'll ever know what's in it?" I considered this as I straightened the chairs around the reading table. "When it's needed," I replied, echoing my daughter's certainty. "That's what she said. When the time is right." He nodded, accepting this with the same trust I felt in Olivia's judgment. It's strange to think how differently things might have gone, he mused, if Ed hadn't anticipated what would happen, if Olivia hadn't been so observant, if we hadn't been willing to hear the truth when it was finally spoken. The alternate timeline hung in the air between us, a version of our family story where divisions deepened rather than healed, where truths remained unacknowledged, where the precious connection between generations was severed rather than strengthened. But that's not what happened, I reminded him gently. We did hear. We did change. All of us. Michael slipped his arm around my waist, drawing me closer as we surveyed the room that had become both sanctuary and symbol, a physical manifestation of values that transcended financial worth, of connections that spanned generations in both directions. The Wilson Peterson reading room, he said, testing the sound of the combined names. It has a good ring to it. It does, I agreed. A legacy worth preserving. Outside our windows, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, delicate flakes swirling in the glow of the street lamps. Inside, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of countless authors and the evolving story of our own family, we stood together in the warmth of a hard-won understanding that the most valuable inheritance isn't measured in dollars or social standing, but in the courage to see beyond inherited assumptions, to speak truth even when it's difficult, and to recognize that the strongest family legacies are built not on material wealth, but on the precious foundation of authentic connection. 3 years later, when Olivia turned 15, she came to me one evening with a familiar look of determination in her eyes and a book in her hands, another of my grandfather's modified volumes with its secret compartment intact. "It's time for the second letter," she said simply, holding it out to me. "Grandpa Ed said I would know when." Michael joined us in the library as I carefully extracted the sealed envelope, addressed in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. "For when healing has begun, but the journey continues." The pages inside contained not instructions or revelations about the past, but something perhaps more valuable. My grandfather's wisdom about moving forward, about the ongoing work of family reconciliation, about the importance of vigilance in maintaining hard-won understanding. He offered insights about adolescence and parenting, about supporting Olivia through her teenage years while respecting her emerging independence, about navigating the complex dynamics of extended family without losing sight of our core values. "He knew," Michael said wonderingly after we'd read the pages together. "Somehow, he anticipated exactly where we would be at this moment." "Not exactly," I corrected gently. "He couldn't know the specifics, but he understood human nature, how change happens, how healing unfolds, how families evolve. He knew the general pattern, even if he couldn't see the particular details." Olivia watched us with quiet satisfaction, aware that she had once again fulfilled her role as guardian of her great-grandfather's wisdom, delivering his insights at precisely the moment when they could be most fully appreciated and applied. "There's still one more," she reminded us, "for later." The knowledge of that final letter, waiting patiently in its hiding place until some future moment of need, felt like a promise, a connection to guidance that transcended time, a reminder that we were part of something larger than our immediate circumstances. The books continued to surround us, their physical presence a constant affirmation of values that had withstood challenge and emerged stronger. The Peterson Wilson reading room at the university had become a reality, drawing scholars and students who appreciated the carefully curated collection for its intellectual significance rather than its monetary worth. Barbara had discovered a passion for literary history, volunteering as a docent and developing expertise in women writers of her grandmother's era. Harold had established a scholarship for art education students, a direct acknowledgement of the value of creative expression he had once dismissed as impractical. And Olivia, growing into her own remarkable self, continued to observe and document, to create art that captured truth, to honor both sides of her heritage while forging her own unique path. The inheritance that had once threatened to divide us had become instead the foundation of a deeper understanding. That legacy isn't contained in objects or accounts, but in the values we choose to preserve and pass forward, in the connections we nurture across generations, and in the courage to recognize when old patterns must give way to new wisdom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.